Every summer in the high Himalayas, above 10,000 feet where the air is thin and the rock faces bake in the sun, something dark and sticky begins to seep out of the cliffs. Local harvesters call it rock sweat. For centuries, the story told across the region was that people first noticed this substance because troops of large Himalayan langur monkeys were seen traveling to these exact cliffs every summer, chewing on the seeping resin and appearing unusually vigorous afterward. That's folklore, not a peer-reviewed observation, and we should treat it exactly that way. A good story, not evidence. But the substance itself is real. It has been used in traditional medicine across Central and South Asia for well over 1,000 years. And in the last 2 decades, it has become one of the most talked about supplements on social media, marketed for everything from testosterone to energy to cellular rejuvenation. That substance is Shilajit, and buried inside it are 2 unusual classes of molecules, fulvic acid and humic acid, that are doing almost all of the biochemical heavy lifting behind whatever real effects this stuff has. Today, we're going to figure out what Shilajit actually is at the molecular level, what the human research does and doesn't support, and, just as important, why the biggest real risk with the supplement isn't the molecule itself, but what else might be riding along with it from an unregulated rock face. Welcome back to Molecules Matter with Dr. Dan. Today's subject is Shilajit, a mineral-rich, tar-like exudate harvested from the high-altitude rock, and the fulvic and humic acids that make up the bulk of its organic content. Here's where we're headed. We'll cover what Shilajit actually is, geologically and chemically, and how that's different from the ancient rejuvenator framing you usually hear. We'll break down fulvic and humic acid specifically, what makes them chemically unusual, and why Shilajit's fulvic acid fraction appears to behave differently than the fulvic acid sold as a generic soil-derived supplement. We'll walk through the actual human clinical trials. There are a number of small, genuinely well-designed ones on testosterone and exercise recovery, and we'll separate those from the much larger pile of animal and cell culture data behind the more dramatic claims. And we'll spend real time on the part most Shilajit content skips entirely, the quality control and heavy metal problem that makes sourcing, not biology, the single most important issue you'll make if you try this. Let's get into it. Origins. What is Shilajit and where does it come from? Shilajit is not a plant, and it's not really a food in the sense most of our episodes cover. It's a geological and biological exudate, a thick, mineral-dense resin that seeps out of layered rock formations at high altitude, most famously in the Himalayas across Nepal, northern India, Tibet, and Bhutan, but also collected in the Altai Mountains of Russia and Central Asia, the Caucasus Mountains, and parts of the Andes. In the Russian and Central Asian tradition, a related substance is called mumi or momio, and it's been used in folk medicine there in parallel with and largely independent of the Ayurvedic tradition around Shilajit. The name itself comes from Sanskrit shila, meaning rock, and jatu or jeet, roughly meaning exudate or conqueror. It's often translated poetically as conqueror of mountains and destroyer of weakness. Whether that's a precise linguistic translation or a flourish added over centuries of retelling is genuinely unclear. But it captures how the substance has been regarded. In classic Ayurvedic texts, Shilajit is described as a rasayana, a rejuvenating tonic, and it shows up in Ayurvedic pharmacology going back well over 1,000 years, historically used for everything from fatigue to bone healing to genitourinary complaints. That's the traditional use claim. What we're going to spend most of today on is what the modern chemistry and clinical research actually say. Here's the part that surprises people. Shilajit isn't mined like a mineral, and it isn't grown like a plant. It's the end product of an extremely slow humification process. Over centuries, Plant material, primarily mosses, lichens, and other high-altitude vegetation, gets trapped between layers of rock in mountain strata. Under the combined pressure of rock layers, microbial activity, and slow geological compression, that organic matter gradually breaks down and transforms into a dense, mineral-infused humic substance. When summer heat warms the rock, that softened resin oozes out through cracks and crevices in the cliff face, where harvesters scrape it off by hand. This matters for a simple reason. Because Shilajit forms from decomposed plant matter compressed with rock and mineral deposits over a very long time scale, it inherits both the organic breakdown products of the plant material, which is where the fulvic and humic acids come from, and whatever minerals and trace elements happen to be present in the surrounding geology. That second part is exactly why sourcing and purification turn out to matter so much, which we'll come back to. What makes it unique? A few things make Shilajit stand out even among unusual traditional substances. First, its consistency changes enormously with processing. Raw Shilajit, scraped from a cliff face, looks like a crumbly, resinous rock. Purified Shilajit is typically softened into a thick, viscous, tar-like resin, and it can also be processed into a fine powder or standardized extract for capsules. Second, it has a genuinely strong, distinctive smell, sharp and mineral, sometimes described as similar to asphalt or diesel, which comes from its volatile organic compound content. Third, it darkens and hardens with air exposure, which is part of why traditional harvesters and processors handle it in sealed containers. And fourth, this is the detail that sets it apart chemically from other humic substances you can and supplements you can buy. Shilajit contains a specific family of compounds called dibenzo-alpha-pyrones that don't show up in the same concentration in generic soil or peat-derived fulvic acid products. We'll get into why that distinction matters in the composition section. Molecular composition. Overall composition. Analyses of Shilajit consistently find that humic substances, fulvic acid and humic acid together, make up somewhere around 80 to 85% of its total organic mass, though the exact fulvic acid to humic acid ratio varies by geographic source, commonly cited in a range of roughly 15 to 21% fulvic acid specifically. The remainder is a mix of moisture, around 18 to 20% minerals by weight, 13 to 17% proteins and amino acids, and small amounts of vitamins, including B1 and B12. Minerals and trace elements. Because Shilajit forms embedded in mineral-rich rock strata, it carries a broad trace mineral profile: iron, zinc, copper, manganese, calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, and potassium among them. I want to flag the iron content specifically now because it becomes relevant later in the cautions section. Shilajit is a genuinely iron-dense substance that has real implications for anyone with an iron overload condition. Signature bioactive compounds: fulvic acid, humic acid, and dibenzo-alpha-pyrones. This is the heart of today's episode. Fulvic acid and humic acid are both classified as humic substances, complex, irregular polymers formed during the decomposition of organic matter. But they behave quite differently in the body. Fulvic acid has the smallest molecular size of the humic substance family and remains soluble across essentially the entire pH range, which means it stays dissolved whether it's in acidic or alkaline environment. That solubility is central to its proposed biological role. Fulvic acid is an unusually effective electron donor and acceptor, giving it a strong free radical scavenging antioxidant chemistry, and researchers have proposed that its small size and chelating structure allow it to bind to minerals and shuttle them across cell membranes more efficiently than the mineral would alone. Humic acid, by contrast, is a large polymer, less water-soluble and less orally bioavailable in its intact form, but it has its own body of laboratory research. including antimicrobial and antiviral activity against certain viruses in cell culture studies, along with anti-inflammatory effects. I want to be direct about the evidence tier here. The antiviral humic acid literature is real and growing, but it's built almost entirely on in vitro and preclinical work, not human clinical trials. So treat it as mechanistically interesting rather than something to act on. Then there's the compound class that actually distinguishes Shilajit from a jar of generic soil-derived fulvic acid, dibenzo-alpha-pyrones, sometimes just called DBPs. Researchers studying Shilajit specifically have described these as mitochondria-targeted antioxidants, meaning laboratory evidence suggests they concentrate in mitochondria, the cell's energy-producing structures, and help regulate oxidative stress there. This is a compound family most closely tied to Shilajit's traditional reputation as an energy and vitality tonic, and it's a meaningfully different mechanism than what you'd get from a fulvic acid supplement sourced from compost or peat, rather than from Shilajit's specific geological and biological process. Rounding out the profile, Shilajit also contains turriculane-type triterpenes, phenolic lipids, and tannoids, a family of tannin-related compounds, all of which contribute to its antioxidant chemistry. How purification and processing change the molecules. This section usually covers cooking, but for Shilajit, the equivalent and arguably more important variable is purification. Raw Shilajit scraped directly from a rock face is not something anyone should consume as is. Along with the fulvic and humic acids, it can carry mycotoxins, free radicals, and reactive polymeric quinones, insect and plant debris, and, depending on the surrounding geology, heavy metals absorbed from the rock itself. Traditional purification addresses this the slow way. The raw resin is dissolved in water, filtered repeatedly through cloth to remove insoluble debris, and then sun-dried, with the process repeated over days or weeks until a cleaner, more concentrated resin remains. Modern manufacturing has largely formalized and standardized this into what is sometimes called a purified and standardized Shilajit process. Controlled extraction and filtration steps designed to remove heavy metals and microbial contaminants while preserving the fulvic acid and dibenzo-alpha-pyrone content, and then standardizing the finished product to a specific fulvic acid percentage. This matters enormously in practice. The branded, standardized extract used in essentially all of the human clinical trials we're about to discuss went through exactly this kind of controlled processing step. Cheap, unprocessed, quote, raw Shilajit sold in informal markets has not gone through that process, and that gap is where the real safety risk with this substance lives. Traditional pairings and theoretical absorption. In Ayurvedic practice, Shilajit is traditionally dissolved in warm milk or warm water before consumption rather than taken dry. The proposed rationale ties back to fulvic acid's role as a mineral carrier. The theory is that dissolving it in a mineral-containing liquid may help it act as an ionophore, which is a molecule that assists in transporting minerals across cell membranes. I want to be careful here, because this is one of the areas where the marketing runs well ahead of the evidence. The ionophore and nutrient carrier mechanism for fulvic acid is chemically plausible and supported by some in vitro work, but there isn't a randomized human trial specifically testing whether taking Shilajit with milk improves absorption of anything compared to taking it with water. So take the milk pairing tradition as exactly that, a tradition with a plausible mechanism behind it, rather than an established, clinically demonstrated absorption boost. Human and cellular clinical research. Let's go finding by finding and be explicit about evidence strength each time, because this is where Shilajit content online tends to blur very different tiers of evidence together. Testosterone. This is Shilajit's best human evidence. A randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial published in Andrologica in 2016 enrolled 96 healthy men between 45 and 55 years old, with 75 completing the full protocol. Participants took 250 milligrams of a purified Shilajit extract twice daily, 500 milligrams total, for 90 consecutive days. By day 90, the treatment group showed a 20.45% increase in total testosterone and a 19.14% increase in free testosterone compared to baseline, both significantly greater than placebo, along with a 31.35% increase in DHEAS. Follicle-stimulating hormone increased significantly in the treatment group, while luteinizing hormone remained stable, a pattern the authors interpreted as Shilajit supporting testosterone synthesis through multiple points in the hormonal pathway rather than a single mechanism. Evidence strength: this is a single well-designed randomized trial with a real effect size, which is genuinely notable. But it's one trial in middle-aged men specifically, and it hasn't yet been independently replicated by a separate research group. That's promising, not proven beyond doubt. Exercise-induced fatigue and muscular strength. A separate randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial published in the Journal of the International Society of Sports Nutrition in 2019 studied 63 recreationally active young men, average age around 21. Participants received either 250 milligrams per day, 500 milligrams per day, or placebo of a standardized Shilajit extract for 8 weeks, then performed a fatiguing exercise protocol. 50 maximal leg extensions. In participants with higher baseline strength, the higher dose group retained significantly more strength after the fatigue protocol than the low dose or placebo groups, and also showed lower post-exercise levels of serum hydroxyproline, which is a marker of collagen breakdown. Evidence strength: one solid trial, dose-dependent effect, but again, a single study in young healthy men using a specific branded extract. And I'll note directly that trials like this are typically funded by the ingredient manufacturer, which doesn't invalidate the data, but it's worth knowing. Fulvic acid and tau protein. Now we move into cell culture territory. A 2011 study published in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease found that fulvic acid inhibited the aggregation of tau protein and even promoted disassembly of existing tau fibrils in a laboratory model. Tau aggregation being one of the hallmark pathological processes in Alzheimer's disease. This got picked up widely online as Shilajit fights Alzheimer's. And I want to slow that down considerably. This is an in vitro cell-based finding. There is no human cognitive trial testing whether Shilajit supplementation affects dementia risk, cognitive decline, or Alzheimer's progression in people. It's a genuinely interesting mechanistic lead, worth continued research, and nothing more than that right now. Chronic fatigue and mitochondrial bioenergetics. Animal research, specifically a rat model of chronic fatigue syndrome-like behavior, found that Shilajit modulated the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis and improved markers of mitochondrial bioenergetics. Again, this is rodent data. It supports a biologically plausible energy-related mechanism consistent with the dibenzo-alpha-pyrone research we covered earlier. But it hasn't been directly tested as a treatment for fatigue in humans through a comparable clinical trial. High-altitude adaptation. You'll frequently see Shilajit marketed for altitude sickness and oxygen transport, and there is a published review specifically framing Shilajit as beneficial for high-altitude physiological stress, drawing partly on its traditional use by populations living at extreme elevation and partly on its antioxidant and mineral profile. I want to be precise about what this is. It's a theoretical and review-level discussion of plausible mechanisms, not a randomized controlled trial showing Shilajit improves oxygen saturation or reduces altitude sickness symptoms in climbers or trekkers. This is one of the bigger evidence gaps between what's marketed and what's been tested. Broad antioxidant and anti-inflammatory activity. Across dozens of cell culture and animal studies, fulvic acid, humic acid, and Shilajit extracts consistently show free radical scavenging and anti-inflammatory activity, which lines up with their electron-donating chemistry. This is well characterized at the chemical level. Translating this molecule is a good electron donor in a test tube into this improves a specific health outcome in a person is exactly the gap the testosterone and exercise recovery trials start to fill, and exactly the gap that most other Shilajit claims haven't filled yet. So here's my honest summary of where the evidence stands. 2 small but well-designed human randomized trials, testosterone and exercise recovery, show real statistically significant effects. A meaningful body of preclinical and cell culture research supports plausible mechanisms behind the antioxidant, mitochondrial, and even neuroprotective claims. But the jump from promising cell and animal data to proven human benefit hasn't happened yet for most of what Shilajit is marketed for, which is cognition, altitude, immune function, general anti-aging claims. That gap is normal for a supplement this early in its clinical research trajectory, but it means that confident claims you see in advertising are running well ahead of what's actually been demonstrated in people. Who should be cautious? Risks and interactions. Let's talk through this responsibly, because a real risk profile of Shilajit is a little unusual compared to most things we cover on this show. The biggest concern isn't really the fulvic or humic acid molecules themselves, it's what else might be in the product. Heavy metal contamination is a headline concern. Because Shilajit forms embedded in rock and is harvested from natural mineral deposits, unpurified or poorly processed product can carry elevated lead, arsenic, mercury, or cadmium, depending on the source geology and how carefully it was purified. The encouraging news, when Consumer Lab, an independent testing organization, tested 8 popular branded Shilajit products in 2024, lead, cadmium, arsenic, and mercury levels in every tested product came in beneath the level of concern for a single daily dose. The less encouraging news, that reflects established, reputable brands that Consumer Lab chose to test. It doesn't mean every Shilajit product on the market, particularly cheap raw resin sold without third-party testing, meets the same standard. This is the one area of today's episode where I'd say the sourcing decision matters more than almost anything else we'll discuss. Iron overload. Given Shilajit's naturally high iron content, anyone with hemochromatosis or another iron overload condition should avoid using it, or use it only under a physician's supervision. And it's worth being thoughtful about combining it with separate iron supplementation. Pregnancy and breastfeeding. There simply isn't enough data in these populations, so the responsible default is to avoid it. Autoimmune conditions and immunosuppressant medications. Some of the preclinical research suggests immunomodulatory activity from the humic acid fraction. That effect isn't well characterized in humans, but if you're on immunosuppressive therapy or manage an autoimmune condition, that theoretical interaction is worth a conversation with your physician before adding this in. Dose-related side effects. Animal toxicology work cited in review literature found no adverse effects on major organs at doses of 0.2 to 1 gram per kilogram of body weight sustained over 3 months, a wide safety margin at the doses typically used in humans. That said, the same literature notes that in people, higher doses in the range of roughly 0.9 to 1.5 grams per day have been associated with transient symptoms like low-grade fever and increased sweating. That's well above the 250 to 500 milligram range used in the clinical trials we discussed, which reinforces that more isn't necessarily better here. Regulatory status. Shilajit is not evaluated or approved by the FDA for any medical condition. It's sold as a dietary supplement, which means manufacturing oversight and quality verification fall much more heavily on the brand's own testing practices than they would for a pharmaceutical. Combine that with Consumer Lab's other 2024 finding that fulvic acid content across tested Shilajit products varied by nearly 32,000%. From under 7 milligrams to over 2,200 milligrams per serving, often without the fulvic acid amount even listed on the label. And the picture is clear. Product quality in this category is inconsistent enough that the brand you choose matters as much as the decision to try it at all. So look for a brand that advertises and standardizes the fulvic acid content. How much should you take? Based on the 2 solid human trials we reviewed, 250 to 500 milligrams per day of a purified, standardized Shilajit extract is the range with actual clinical support. That's the dose window used in both the testosterone study and the exercise recovery study. If you're trying it, start at the lower end, around 250 milligrams a day, and assessing tolerance before considering an increase is a reasonable conservative approach. There's no good evidence that pushing well past that range produces additional benefit, as we just covered, because doses above roughly 900 milligrams a day have been associated with transient side effects in some reports. More is not the goal here. A standardized, verified product at a modest research-aligned dose. Sourcing notes. This is arguably the most important practical section of today's episode. First, purified versus raw. Never consume raw Shilajit scraped directly from rock without proper purification. This is where the heavy metal and contaminant risk concentrates. Look specifically for products labeled as purified, processed, or standardized, ideally with a stated fulvic acid percentage on the label. Second, third-party testing. Given the contamination risk and the wild variability Consumer Lab documented in actual fulvic acid content, a certificate of analysis from independent testing covering heavy metals and confirming the labeled fulvic acid content is worth actively looking for before you buy, not something to assume it's happening behind the scenes. Third, geographic origin. You'll see marketing claims that Himalayan source Shilajit is superior to Altai source Shilajit or vice versa. There isn't strong comparative clinical evidence establishing one geographic source as meaningfully more effective than another. Processing quality and verified purity matter far more than the region printed on the label. Fourth, form. Resin, powder, and capsules are all viable delivery forms. The clinical trials use the standardized extract in capsule form, which has the practical advantage of consistent, measurable dosing compared to scooping a variable amount of resin. Myths versus facts. Myth. Any dark, sticky substance sold as Shilajit is essentially the same product, and raw is more authentic and therefore better. Fact. Raw unpurified Shilajit is exactly the version most likely to carry heavy metals, mycotoxins, and debris from the surrounding rock. Purification and standardization are what make it a reasonably safe supplement, not a step that dilutes its authenticity. Myth. Shilajit is a proven natural testosterone-boosting steroid alternative with dramatic effects. Fact. The one well-designed human trial that we talked about showed a real but modest, roughly 20% increase in total testosterone over 90 days in men aged 45 to 55. A meaningful finding, but a long way from the transformative claims found in a lot of marketing copy. Myth. The fulvic acid in Shilajit is interchangeable with generic fulvic acid supplements derived from soil, peat, or compost. Fact. While chemically related, Shilajit's fulvic acid fraction is packed together with dibenzo-alpha-pyrones specific to its geological and biological formation process, and the mitochondria-targeted antioxidant research is specific to Shilajit's fraction. It hasn't been established that generic soil-derived fulvic acid products carry the same profile or effects. Here's where I land on Shilajit. The underlying chemistry is genuinely interesting. Fulvic acid's unusual solubility and electron transfer properties, humic acid's antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory activity, and the mitochondria-targeted antioxidant behavior of Shilajit's specific dibenzo-alpha-pyrones are all real, well-characterized chemistry. And unlike a lot of trending adaptogens, Shilajit actually has a couple of solid randomized placebo-controlled human trials behind specific claims. The testosterone finding and the exercise recovery finding are genuinely notable, but most of what circulates about Shilajit online cognitive protection, altitude performance, general anti-aging, immune enhancement, rests on cell culture and animal data that hasn't been tested directly in people. And that practical risk, that matters most, because it's not about molecules at all. It's about the wide variability and contamination risk across an unregulated, inconsistently tested supplement category. Good chemistry, a couple of real human trials, and a product quality problem that outweighs the biology. That's the honest picture. 2 things to act on this week if you're considering Shilajit. First, if you're going to try it, choose a purified, standardized product from a brand that publishes third-party testing for heavy metals and states its fulvic acid content on the label. Skip raw resin from unverified sources entirely. Second, set realistic expectations and a conservative dose. Start at around 250 milligrams a day, the low end of what the actual clinical trials used. Treat it as a modest adjunct rather than a dramatic intervention. And check with your doctor first if you have an iron overload condition, are pregnant or breastfeeding, or taking medications that affect iron or immune function. That's Shilajit. Centuries of Himalayan tradition, a genuinely unusual class of humic substance chemistry, 2 solid human trials worth taking seriously, and a quality control problem that deserves just as much of your attention as the molecule itself. If you learned something today, subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who's curious about what's actually inside that jar of resin. The molecules matter because you matter. I'm Dr. Dan, and I'll see you in the next episode.